Recently, a whole bunch of my family and friends sent me the exact same video, and it was the Try Guys video, which is called Why Don't We Care About Disabled People? And this video was incredibly powerful. If you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend watching it. Zach, who now identifies as disabled, interviewed several disability advocates, and they all talked about their experience during the pandemic and the messages that they received and the messages that we had overall on social media. And while I was watching this incredibly powerful video, and probably the reason why so many people sent it to me is that it reminded me exactly of my master's thesis. So today I want to continue this conversation and talk about my master's thesis. If you're new to my channel, hi, my name is Issa, and I am no longer a graduate student. I just received my master's in communication studies with a focus on disability, culture, and identity. For my master's, I completed a thesis, which is an 80-page manuscript exploring the lives and experiences of 30 high-risk disabled individuals during the pandemic. And I have tried so hard trying to summarize this video. Summarize my thesis, and I have tried TikToks and all of these things. And I decided that a YouTube video is probably going to be the best way about getting my participants' stories to you, because it's so important we continue to have these conversations and reflect the lived experience of disabled people. So that is what today's video is going to be about. If you are here because you watch my Disney College program stuff, this is very important. I hope you stay. Otherwise, I do want to provide a trigger warning for COVID-19. The stories that I'm about to share and the experiences that my participants talked about are lived experiences. They are not always pretty, and in fact, there's a lot of hard things. So, with that said, let's get into it. My thesis was largely inspired by all of the social media posts from celebrities, personalities, friends, and family talking about the concept of medical fragility, specifically talking about whether or not disabled people's deaths and lives mattered. These posts were everywhere. They were published by news sources that said only 94% of COVID deaths, or 94% of COVID deaths had comorbidities, which means that several people said that, oh, well, that means only 6% of those deaths count. For example, in 2021, in the fall of 2021, Kyle Brecker, a Fox News producer, tweeted, "COVID did not kill 725,000 people. This is blatantly false. The CDC reports COVID-related deaths. 94% of these had serious comorbidities like heart disease and cancer. The average age of death was 78 years old, basically life expectancy. It's a lazy lie. Stop repeating it." Vanessa Hudgens said that it was sad but kind of inevitable that disabled people were going to die. And in fact, my favorite is this wonderful protest sign from a Tennessee lockdown protest that says, "Sacrifice the weak." These are the messages that I personally observed and experienced during the pandemic, not even talking about the family and friends and the people who were in my vicinity making comments. In fact, I even saw a comment on TikTok of someone else's video where someone said, "Yeah, eugenics isn't all bad though," when referring to disabled people. It's been rough, and as such, I found it incredibly important, especially given everything that was going on with COVID and everything that is still going on with COVID, to provide a space that we document and respect and honor the lived experiences of disabled people in a time in which their voices and their experiences aren't being listened to, in a time that greatly affects them. In order to honor the voices of my participants, I went through a long process that I can talk about later about IRB and research and everything, but I'm going to give you the basics so that you can understand where this project came from. So I conducted 30 interviews. These interviews all occurred over Zoom, and I got to meet with several people who were from North America. All my participants were from North America. And to give you a breakdown of my participants, the only things that I asked for is that they would be high risk and considered disabled, and they had to be over the age of 18. My interviews came to over 1,200 pages of transcription data that I then went through to code and find common themes and highlight exemplars, so highlights of what that theme meant. Incredible articulation by my participants, just saying exactly what so many of them have been saying. So the demographic breakdowns I do want to be very clear about. I had 13 individuals who identified as invisibly disabled, 9 who identified as visibly disabled, and 8 who identified as alternating between visibly and invisibly disabled. I had 19 women and 10 genderqueer non-binary individuals and 1 man. Then I had 24 individuals who identified as white, 3 who identified as mixed, 2 who identified as indigenous, and 1 who identified as a Pacific Islander. So I do want to take space here to recognize that demographic breakdown is a limitation in my work. If you read the PDF, speaking of which, if you want a copy of the PDF, comment down below, or even better, jump onto my Instagram and send me a message and I will get you a copy of my thesis. But it is a limitation that I want to note here because it's important that our conversations reflect the accurate representation of the disabled population, which is not majority white people. This leads us to the results. The results are broken up into 3 major themes that each have their own sub-themes. I'm not going to explain each of the sub-themes with their different titles, but I will talk about kind of the overarching elements and touch on each sub-theme. What's important to note here is that the themes are based somewhat on time of how each moment of the pandemic up until September of 2021, when I collected the data, kind of reflected in my participant stories, starting with the early pandemic and individuals who talked about their hope for a more accessible future, to this cultural negotiation of morality that occurred during most of the pandemic, and the reconstruction of identity that was occurring for my participants at the time of my interviews. To start off, let's talk about this potential for a more accessible future. A lot of my participants kind of compared their experience prior to the pandemic to during the pandemic. They talked about having to go through soft lockdowns, having to practice some forms of social distancing, wearing masks, that they have been medically fragile for a long time and having to take care of themselves in that time of fragility. However, COVID created a context where everybody was experiencing some type of medical fragility, and that this conversation they had hoped would make it so that in the future after COVID, people would be more understanding of what they go through, since everybody had experienced this isolation period at some time or another. And luckily for a lot of my participants, they did experience some type of initial support. I had a participant who talked about how some doctors and nurses, when she was staying at the hospital, went above and beyond to help her prepare for a band audition that she really wanted to do, and that was during COVID, and they'd done all these things to help her make sure that she was safe and still being able to pursue her dreams. But this also leads me to one of the other elements of this potential for a more accessible future, which is technology. The same participant talked about how Zoom is so instrumental into allowing her to have all this time that she ended up in the hospital for unrelated COVID reasons, and have the ability to stay in school, to stay connected with people, to be on top of everything. And she actually had all of these honors at the end of the year, which was absolutely incredible because of the technology that was available. all of these other participants talked about work from home and how that shaped their ability to take care of their bodies and to take care of their needs and finally get the accommodations that they needed. In fact, I have one participant's quotation here that says that the work from home situation really brought to light that they could do that. Virtual accommodations, work, doctors, telehealth visits, and things that we always wanted to be accessible and never were. And while that came with some level of bitterness that it took a pandemic to get there, there was that underlying hope that it would make it accessible overall. One of my participants talked about being busier than ever, especially with Zoom, because everyone wanted to connect, especially during a time of isolation. They said, I was more busy than ever. I was doing Zoom calls every Friday night, and then all my other friends wanted to hang out because we were all locked at home. And they talked specifically about connecting with other disabled people because Zoom created an opportunity for them to connect not just on this one-to-one level, but as a group, like they would if they were all hanging out together, which was really cool. But it provided this context for being included in society even when you had to stay home for whatever reason. Unfortunately, the accommodations and the hope that was initially felt were quickly taken away during the cultural moral negotiations that occurred during the majority of the pandemic. Starting off with non-accommodation, one of my participants explained that that's the grossest part of it all. They took our words and started using them, and now they're taking it away. There were accommodations, and they called them that, and now they're saying they're not necessary. That the moment that non-disabled people didn't need accommodations anymore, then there was this underlying assumption that disabled people didn't need it either. One of my participants were told that several of my participants were told that if they wanted to be safe, they had to take the precautions onto themselves and isolate. One of my participants, who was a PhD student, just started their program, was told that if they wanted to be part of this class, they could either sit in the corner of the room, isolated from everyone else, not interact with anyone, or they could stay at home, be on Zoom, no camera, no voice, no interaction from the classroom whatsoever. And if you know anything about grad classes, they are highly, highly involved. To get the full experience, you need to be able to be part of the classroom environment, and that was taken away. Other participants talked about being told or being set up at Zoom and just facing a wall and no one ever paying attention to them. That even when these accommodations were given, they were given half-heartedly after non-disabled people didn't need them anymore. Beyond workplace and class accommodations, several participants also struggled with medical resources, that they were told that they could not, that there were shortages and reallocations of resources, that they did not get the resources that they had needed prior to the pandemic, that they needed during the pandemic, and they will continue to need post-pandemic. In fact, one of our participants talked about how they were never believed that there was something wrong with their pump until the pump exploded. And she explained in her frustration, I'm like, now do you believe me? Now do you believe, so then I lose 2/3 of what I own? The frustration with the medical community, with the world around them, for just the basic lack of accommodations, made participants feel that they lacked autonomy and agency and individuality, that their freedoms were being stripped away from them by the people around them, by the people who are supposed to care about them. One of my participants put it beautifully as a high-risk mother of high-risk children. They were so concerned about their personal comfort that they took away our freedom. And so, since March of last year, my freedom, my son's freedom, my husband's freedom, my daughter's freedom, and so many people like me have been limited to our homes. Another participant explained that it's basically a line that I couldn't cross. Maybe the general public doesn't have these high-risk elements. You know, they could cross that line in terms of wearing a mask. They just didn't cross that line. When we're on two opposite sides, I couldn't cross it, and they weren't willing to do so. where at the end of the day, no matter how long we go around in a circle, try to come up with these extreme ideas on how to keep me involved, it was really hard because I want to be around these people. I want to be around my friends, but you keep going around in a circle and we're never going to compromise in terms of where that line is. When individuals were not dealing with non-accommodations, they also experienced several instances of people politicizing their advocacy for their own safety. A lot of participants talked about that prior to the pandemic, their advocacy largely came in the form of education, awareness campaigns on social media, which nobody had an issue with until COVID. I had participants who explained that they were called sheep for just talking about COVID and how it affects high-risk people. I had participants who talked about family members who went down conspiracy theories and down those lines and decided that they no longer wanted to do anything to protect them. One of my participants explained it's politicized to the point where people aren't making science-based decisions about their health. They're making political-based decisions about their health. What these messages, the non-accommodation and the political messages did is it created this process of internalizing messages, these demoralizing and dehumanizing messages, which said that you are a sacrifice I'm willing to make. One of my participants told a story about how she was on the phone with a medical provider who was not helping and they were getting in a fight, and this was her young daughter's response. My daughter grabbed a chair and she pushed it all the way up against my wheelchair. I can't move and I'm like trying to deal with the provider and she's just sitting there against me, like physically against me. And I'm like, what are you doing? She's like, I'm here to protect you. They're going to kill you. Before, like I go to the doctor, she was at the school, then I come back. She never had to hear anything, so she has no idea what's going on. It's not like I tell her much because she doesn't need to be worried about that. That's not kid stuff. Not only were participants' family members, especially young kids, understanding in some elements of what was going on and what people were saying, but it also created a context because of this isolation in the home where everything was coming together, life, work, family, friends, happening at the home, that this division and prior understanding of roles and identity were becoming and have become a little more complex, especially when there is a division between disabled identity and others' identities. Other participants talked about the direct messaging that they received, moral messages about the worthiness of their lives. I've always known that, like society as a whole, didn't really care about disabled people. I knew it, but I didn't feel it in the way that I have felt it during this pandemic. Like there's just this, I guess it was the news stories where people were like, oh, only disabled people are going to die. News stories that feel like, oh, only you're going to die and that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. Every day it just kind of wears you down. Another person talked about an argument that they got with another individual where they tried to create a connection. And this is what happened. I remember specifically saying to one person, do you know anyone in your life that you love that is high risk? And they were like, well, my grandma's lived a good life, and if she has to go for the sake of the economy, she has to go. Other individuals talked about how they received messages that said, people are like, oh, if you're afraid to die, just stay home. I'm like, I'm not afraid to die, but I am afraid to not live. And I feel like right now, a lot of people are just not living their life. And I'm like, why am I wasting my last remaining good years potentially just like stuck in my house? My participants were not all older individuals, not saying that older individuals' lives don't matter. They came from a long range of ages, of identities, of backgrounds. I had parents and teachers and students and young 18-year-olds. That the individuals in this study alone were people who have complicated lives that are far beyond the messages that they received about the worth of those lives. Also talked about being patronized during the pandemic, being treated that they didn't know what was going on, didn't know how to advocate for themselves, didn't know what they needed. One of my participants, who was the PhD student, explained they should have had the expectation that I can do these things. Like, I'm an adult, let alone an adult who's able to get into this program. I should not be questioned as much as I am. Like, I know I can do this, I just need these simple accommodations. Another participant explained how a TikTok during the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests helped them identify exactly what they were afraid of. And in that TikTok, it said that for Black women, it was the hospitals. They explained, because every time I would end up in the hospital, I never was listened to. As a biracial woman, my mother was white. They would listen to my mother before they would listen to me. And this fear impacted their decision to seek out care when they had COVID during the summer of 2020. Several of my participants talked about stories of other disabled individuals, from news, from their family, from their friends, people that they cared about who went into hospitals and never came out. One of my participants talked about Michael Hickson, a Black disabled man who went into the hospital with COVID and was essentially told that his quality of life did not warrant further care. However, the way that that hospital understood further care is that they removed all food and water from him, and he died from the lack of food and water. Another participant described a phone call they received from a friend where the friend said, "Please take care of my fiance because I'm going to die." And then when he was in the hospital, he would hear nurses being like, "Yeah, patient in bed number 2 isn't going to make it. We're not going to bother." And he could hear them talking about the person he's sitting next to. Like, how can you deny that kind of thing happening? Like, this is not inconsequential. This is not an overreaction. This is real. Just because you don't know someone who hasn't had to go through it doesn't mean it doesn't actually exist. That one's a hard one. All of this is hard. When the world around you is discrediting the deaths of individuals like you, the deaths of your family, of your friends, of your community, and saying that your quality of life means that those deaths are inconsequential, it leads to this process of having to restructure and understand the way that you relate to others. This leads us to our final theme of reconstructing identity. In this reconstruction of identity, participants went through several stages. First, really processing what was happening, processing and breaking down their internalized ableism and the way that the systems around them affected them. These demoralizing and dehumanizing messages triggered a process in which individuals had to reconsider the way that they view themselves, the way that they view those around them, and how they're going to interact in that world in the future, particularly in non-disabled spaces. This process started by this self-reflection period. During the self-reflection period, participants talked about how they had to deconstruct their internalized ableism, how they had to reconsider whether or not they identified as disabled. I had a participant who talked about that prior to the pandemic, they wouldn't have considered themselves high risk. They wouldn't have considered themselves disabled. But the messages, the world around them, the vulnerability of the pandemic redefined the way that they viewed their own health and the way that they viewed their relationship to the world around them. Some participants explained that they felt better able to take care of their bodies, more confident, more resilient, however, at the same time, more jaded and bitter. This complex relationship with their bodies, where they were better able to listen and advocate for their bodies, came at the same time of not letting other people decide what they should do with their bodies, which meant that for some that they had to separate from the non-disabled individuals in their lives. One of my participants explained that they had to remind the people in their lives that when they talked about high-risk disabled individuals, when they talked about the 94% that is me. Participants explained that they had to start putting up boundaries and renegotiating their relationships with other people and what they're willing to compromise. If you're not willing to make these accommodations, knowing how sick I could get, I'm not willing to be around you. By separating from the non-disabled community, this is different from the isolation that they felt prior, because this is an action. This was an enactment of agency and autonomy. And at the same time, by isolating from and separating from non-disabled people, participants explained that it redefined the way that they view their community, that suddenly the people that they were connecting with were also disabled. They were the people who understood. They were the people who also had to take care of themselves. And it made that the relationships that stayed with disabled or non-disabled people more authentic and true, because they knew that their morals stood on the same ground. Participants explained that by separating, they reclaimed their identity. We're starting to realize the value of our own lives versus what society thinks. It created a new level of passion for advocacy and reinvigorated individuals to feed back into the world and feed back into the disabled community. Now I'm more straight up with people. Before the pandemic, I would brush off a lot and downplay my limitations, and now I tell people my limitations before I even show up. So yeah, I used to push myself until I was injured, and now I warn people that if it's not accessible, I'm not going because I'm going to get injured. And that's where my mindset is. I see myself as more confident in my ability to care for my body. Another participant explained that they own being disabled, that before they would see disability in relation to strength. However, the pandemic reinforced this concept of vulnerability, kind of breaking away from the stereotypes they saw disability with inspiration porn and this concept of overcoming, to centering this truly vulnerable and precious thing that is their life. They explained, I don't want to be called resilient, I don't want to be called stoic or stubborn, I just want to relax for once, please. I feel like that's the crux of everything that has happened, that it's breaking away from these expectations that disabled people felt that were placed on them, that they continue to uphold, and now finding a way to pave their own path and center their community and their identity and their vulnerability in all of this. So what do these results mean? And this gets into some of the practical and theoretical implications of my thesis. Alright, so let's get into the first implication, which I find very exciting. I've tried to talk about this on my TikTok, but TikTok keeps suppressing it. So let's get into it. It's that COVID created a renegotiation of disabled identity. That prior to the pandemic, we had several iterations. I've talked about this on my YouTube in the past. Several iterations of the different models of disability. What does it mean to be disabled? We have the social model, which argues that you are only disabled when the environment around you is inaccessible. We have the social relational model, which tries to encompass some elements of embodiment of disability, and that it is when the embodied experience interacts with others. We have the pathic model, which says that disability is based off of pain, and that there are areas of pain that are physical and there are areas of pain that are external, created by inaccessible and insufficient support systems. However, my participants explained this renegotiation of identity where instead of talking about the ways that they interact with non-disabled people, accessibility, accommodations, those types of things, disability is born from an internal sense of vulnerability, specifically in high-risk disabled individuals, and community. That is a core relationship between these two things. And so it kind of encompasses and really defines the disabled community as part of the disabled identity. Because what's interesting is that all of these moral messages that occurred were largely not directed at the individual, where microaggressions and different interactions might be directed at the individual. You can't have a single accommodation. I'm going to throw your kid on your lap. I had that happen in the wild recently, where someone just threw their kid in my lap to push them around because the kid was curious about my wheelchair. Interesting life, but that is a very individual type of ableism, where during the pandemic, suddenly all these people are saying the quiet parts out loud and directing it towards the community. And so it's not just seen as a personal attack, it's seen as an attack on the community that I am a part of, which reinforces the boundaries of that community and reinforces the internal protections of that community, which I think is so cool. And it's so important for the way that we move forward post-pandemic, and even during this pandemic. This leads me to a more theoretical element of my thesis, and I hope you can stick with me because we have to jump into some bodies of lit to explain. But the thesis of this argument is that when stigma questions the value of someone's life, that stigma management is inherently a negotiation of morality. Now, what this means is that two of the bodies of literature that I used is stigma management communication and negotiation and morality. Now, these two theories have their own backgrounds. Stigma management communication is largely about in-group, out-group behaviors that are ways to maneuver those in-groups and out-groups and reduce stigma overall. However, while stigma, this theory is largely based off of disability and other marginalized identities, has this kind of element in the communication world of being seen as feelings and being included and those kind of things, which is important. However, isn't fully accurate to represent what it means in the process and the labor of stigma management, which is why I pair it with Waldron and Kelly's negotiation of morality. And in that theory, it's been largely used in more interpersonal, one-on-one kind of interactions, and it argues that we interpret all of our relationships with reference to implicit or explicit values, and that our value systems are negotiated between each other. And it was typically used for forgiveness. So if you think about it, is that when you're trying to forgive someone, that there is this element of give and take and negotiating the ways that you're going to move around your core value systems and your core value systems in that relationship particularly. And so what I argue is that there is an element of labor and an element of urgency, because when there is this moral negotiation, it can be triggered by moral crisis, and that it triggers communication overall, which are some of the other implications. And what that means is that stigma management, when it is to fight against this questioning of value of your life, is a moral negotiation, that there's this new level of new level of urgency and a new level of importance and heaviness in the individual who has to go through that stigma management, which means so much beyond just disability advocacy. It has the potential of reflecting all marginalized identity, where we have to fight for the very right to exist. That advocacy isn't just about hurt feelings, it isn't just about being included, it is about protecting the very lives of our communities. So overall, that is what my thesis is about. And like I said earlier, if you would like a copy of it, please follow. I'm going to include a link tree down there in the in my description, that you can follow to my Instagram. If you would like a copy, feel free just to send me a message and say, hey, I'd like a copy, and we'll figure out a way to get you a copy. With that said, I really think this is important, as COVID has been a mass disabling event, and there are very complicated feelings and relationships between disabled individuals and newly disabled individuals, when individuals who are newly disabled didn't believe in COVID, didn't believe in the heaviness of COVID or the impact of COVID until they were disabled, which means that they put the community that they're joining at risk. And there have been some very eloquent videos talking about the complicated relationships, specifically with Crutches and Spice, that I can think off of the top of my head. If you don't already follow her on TikTok, please do, because she's incredible advocate. She's also featured in the Try Guys video. Anyway, this is my thesis, and if you have any questions or would like to know anything else about it, this is summarized to the best of my ability, and so I would love to provide some clarity, even make up follow-up videos if you would like. If you have any questions about the research aspects and how that worked in qualitative research, I would love to do that. What has been your experience during the pandemic? Because collecting these stories should not stop in September of 2021, that every single experience is invaluable, and that the more we document these experiences, the more we reflect and honor the individuals that have lived through this, the people who we have lost, that is what this thesis is dedicated to. It is dedicated to us, our community, the disabled community, the high-risk individuals, everyone we have lost, everyone we have yet to join our community, because they all mattered. And Amani said this in a TikTok, Crutches and Spice, and I'll never forget it. I wrote it in my bullet journal that day. And when talking about the COVID deaths, when talking about the 94%, when talking about our community, she said, they mattered. They all mattered. You matter.